The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and FreedomSlips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, FreedomSlips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another edition of Cosmic Catastrophe on Revolution.radio. I'm your host, Diamond, from the Oppenheimer Ranch Project. My lovely co-host, Leah Shaper, is joining us this evening.
Hello.
This afternoon or this morning.
This noon, for us anyway.
Welcome to another exciting episode of Cosmic Catastrophe. We're going to be talking about many interesting topics today. A paper that caught my attention yesterday, Earth is barreling towards uncharted climate territory. We're going to kick off the show, the first half, with that article and a new report that is coming out that's, telling us we're all going to die. We're also going to hit on a congressionally mandated report on solar radiation management. We're going to talk about life expectancy from the Paleolithic to the present, and I think you might be surprised at some of the revelations there. And in the second half, hopefully, if we get to all these topics, we will be discussing a 476,000-year-old wooden structure in Zambia that was not made by Homo sapiens, maybe Homo naledi, the first Homo species to bury its dead. We'll get to that in the second half, and we might even touch on the aquatic ape hypothesis. Whew. Are you ready?
That's a lot of stuff.
Yep. Are you ready?
I am ready. Let's go for the roller coaster.
Up. All right. You looked at this article, didn't you? Earth is thundering towards a planet unfit for humans, according to a report.
Yeah, I sure did. It is just full of alarmist phrases and misleading information. It's kind of hysterical. It is hysterical, and in both the sense that it's funny and hysterical in the sense that it's delusionally, I don't know, manic. I don't know how to put it exactly.
Well, it's coming from an extremely woke area here, Oregon State.
Yeah.
We know what's happening over there. But the research led by Oregon State University scientists cast dire warnings, saying big changes are needed now.
Oh, not just big changes. They called it profound measures are needed to protect people and the environment.
Oh,
it's language
dear.
like that, right? Which points right at like climate lockdown stuff. It's just full of language like that.
Well, we might get into some of those profound measures in a minute when we talk about that mandated solar radiation management from
I'm curious to hear about that.
Congress. But here is the paper coming from Oxford Academic Bioscience, the 2023 State of the Climate Report, Entering Uncharted Territory. There's a bunch of alarmist scientists here and their names on it. And they cite things like unprecedented temperatures coming from models, and some other things. What did you glean from the paper? Did you look at the paper, the report, I mean?
I didn't look at the paper. I just looked at the article.
Okay.
That was written about it. So it's kind of interesting in the article because you get the hysteria coming from both the original report plus the spin of the person who wrote the article, right? So they're using language like, Earth is under siege, or time is up, or we have to avert an all-out meltdown. That's pretty crazy.
Time is up for what? For who?
Right.
Here are the facts. What we're looking at in Radioland is a climate-related disaster kill chart. And climate-related disasters are killing ever fewer people every single decade. This chart goes back to the 1920s, where there was over 500,000 people, annual average deaths by decade, 500,000 people per decade back in the 1920s killed by climate-related disasters. Guess what's happening now? Zero, essentially.
Pretty much.
Yeah, so very dangerous situations and times we're entering into here.
Right. Which in and of itself is interesting, right? Because we've harped on this a few times, but in the 1930s, there were a lot of record highs. It was quite hot during the 30s. And you have a much more elevated number back then. So that's kind of interesting in and of itself. I mean, surely that's not the only factor, but
about 500,000 people died back then.
yeah.
Now, a lot of these papers claim that we're in a catastrophic scenario here with Antarctica, and the West Antarctic ice sheet is catastrophically going to melt. All the major cities are going to go underwater. But when you look at the data, there is essentially no change since we began keeping records back in the 1980s.
Yeah. Well, and that's another funny thing, right? So this paper cites the fact that in February of 2023, the Antarctic sea ice extent was the lowest on record, which is true. However, even NOAA, this is what NOAA says about Antarctic sea ice extents, that they've been extremely variable, both seasonally and year to year. In the past decade, we've had record and near record high extents, as well as record and near record lows. And the overall long-term trend since 1979 is nearly flat, which is true. So, and they even acknowledge that they can't see at this time a trend of decreasing Antarctic sea ice extents because the data is simply not there. It's not there in the trend.
Right. And the highest ever recorded was in 2014, which was less than a decade ago.
Right. So, we're using this one little data point of 2023 and it being a record low sea ice extent in the Antarctic and using that to claim that the Earth is on fire. But that's complete nonsense. And as we pointed out many times too, that there is a cyclical variability in this.
And it's also arguable that back in 1986, it was in fact lower based on this data.
But that graph is for the maximum.
Yeah.
So for that same time frame for the minimum, what year was that? 1980 something?
86.
Yeah, I mean it was not a particularly low sea ice minimum.
So what you should glean from this data set is that things change. And if we go over to the Arctic ice extent, we are in fact at a 10-year or essentially a 10-year high in extent and area. Mm-hmm. And there was a low point here back in 2020, yes, but things go up and down. And even more revealing is the surface mass budget at Greenland, which has been increasing for 3 consecutive years in record ways.
Yeah.
They just gained about a week ago over 12 gigatons, which broke all records dating back to 1981 for that date. So that clearly doesn't show anything catastrophic happening on Greenland, yet the mainstream media continues to report on the catastrophic melting of Greenland ice caps.
Well, and as we've discussed on this show before, there is a cyclical shift, right, in these cycles of Arctic and Antarctic sea ice extents. And typically when the Arctic has more ice, the Antarctic has less and vice versa. So it's not out of the realm of normalcy that there are changes in these sea ice extents.
Yeah, and what I'm pulling up here is the yearly change. And this gray region here is the 30-year average going back to 81. And you can see blue is this year. We're well above the multi-decadal average. And we have been for almost the entire month of October.
Right. Well, and then look at 2022 to 2023, right? Like that gray line there at the other end of the peak exceeds some of the previous years.
Yeah. Yeah. So the mainstream media is clearly lying, or they're just creating false narratives without even checking data.
Well, I mean, what they're doing, right, is they're taking, like I said earlier, like one data point, and then they're using that to make some giant claim. Like there's another claim in here in the report and the article that that in July we clocked the highest daily average surface temperature ever measured, which was possibly the planet's hottest day in the last 100,000 years. But if you look at the last 100,000 years, 100,000 years ago, we had a record high, and then it dropped off a cliff into a low, and this is what happens every 100,000 years. We just happen to be at the top of the peak right now. Guess what happens next? We fall off the cliff, because that's the pattern in history, and we can see that in our graphs.
Yeah, this is the Vostok data, and it shows a 12 degrees C change every 110,000 years or so.
Right.
That is extremely marked. the as you descend into these 80,000 year ice ages, every 100,000 year cycle, there is a marked removal from that ice age every single time into an interglacial. The last one, called the Eemian, was in fact a 2 degrees C warmer than any temperature recorded during the Holocene.
Right. Right.
So it was much warmer during the Eemian, and also back here 330,000 years ago, potentially even warmer than the Eemian.
Right. Right. I mean, it's hilarious, right? Because what these people are doing is they make a statement, which in and of itself, out of context, is not, it's not untrue. They're not saying something not factual, but out of the context, it doesn't lead to the conclusions that they're claiming it does.
But what they all are leaning towards, these globalist psychopaths that are lying in plain sight, what they're all leaning to is geoengineering. And this brings us to the White House congressionally mandated report on solar radiation modification. Are you aware of this?
No.
According to the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2022, related to solar radiation modification, also known as solar geoengineering, a report had to be made, and the report, in fact, is out and it is available for your perusal. 44 pages. Congressionally mandated research plan and initial research governance framework related to solar radiation modification. So this report was created because, why do you think?
Because they think we need to block out the sun.
They're about to do that, yeah.
Right, and you've got Bill Gates behind that, ready to go.
Absolute insanity. And the reason it's insane is because if you just look at the paleoclimatic data, you could smack sense into any scientist to show him the natural climate variability in the last 500,000 years is far outweighs any IPCC report or any of the fearmonger stats that they even try to shove down our throats.
Yeah. Well, and then the thing about this that I always wonder about, it's like, what's ultimately the agenda with doing something like blocking out the sun? I can see it two ways. One is the elites would like to, bring the temperature on Earth down, which is going to happen anyway, regardless of what they do, and then claim that they are responsible for fixing the climate crisis. Or the agenda is actually depopulation, right? Because this is what happens in interglacials. Human populations tend to go down. We don't thrive as much. All of the warm periods feature high civilization. So it's one or the other. Neither one of them is beneficent. It's nefarious.
Yeah, and cold kills 7 times more people than warm.
Right.
So reducing the temperature just by one degree would cause significant amount of hardship and death. At the same time, they're trying to eliminate oil and gas from being produced. This is also what keeps us warm and safe in cold times.
Right. Right.
So if you clearly put if you add it all up, it's right in plain sight what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Now, the question is, how can almost half the population that's aware of this be in support of it?
Well, it's partially for what I said earlier. It's the way that this is construed by the media, right? You take one data point, you state a fact, you draw an alarmist conclusion from that, and then people freak out. Oh my God, we're all going to die.
We are all going to die.
Yeah, this is true.
And that's a really good segue to life expectancy.
Yes.
Now, life expectancy is a statistical measure of the estimate of the span of your life. Imagine that. It is most commonly used to measure life expectancy at birth or the length of a life at a birth cohort. Now, what the heck does any of that mean? Well, here's some interesting stats I wanted to share with everyone. Life expectancy, for the most part, going all the way back to the Paleolithic, has remained constant. And most people almost didn't live at all to be old. Yeah. So life expectancy was typically under 30 years for everyone for the entire Holocene.
Yeah. But what is pointed out smartly about, using the life expectancy at birth is that you have to realize that there are many, many, many people who die in infancy and before the age of 5. So once you start looking at the numbers outside of that, it changes quite a bit, right? Like if you make it to 20, your odds of making it to 50 are pretty darn good.
Yeah, that's interesting. So people did live to old lives, but it was just a small percentage of people.
Well, yeah, I suppose. Yeah. I mean, it really depends on what the mortality rate for infancy and childhood was. But I mean, I find this sort of interesting, right? Because there's this narrative out there that we've never lived as long as we live today. And that's partially true, but it creates this perception that like no one lived beyond the age of like 30 at certain periods of time. And that's really not true.
Not true at all, because our species, Homo sapien, has a maximum average length of for 104 years old.
Yeah.
So, and that's the entire time the species is existing. It wasn't lower at the beginning of the species as it is now. It's
Right.
the same. Every human can live to 104 years old based on everything we know about our bodies.
Mhm.
The problem is that we've got pollutants and toxins and things that kill us all early. And back there, further back you go, the more difficult it was to overcome things like childbirth and disease.
Right. Right.
Now, if we could bring this back pre-Diluvian, pre-Holocene, can you imagine how short life expectancy would be back then when half of the things walking on Earth want to eat you?
Right. Well, not only that, but like, okay, if you look at this Wikipedia entry on life expectancy, I think it actually does a fairly good job of, looking at different life expectancies around the world, looking at the difference between life expectancy at birth versus age 5. I think it's fairly thorough, but what it doesn't account for is things like climatic change, like periods of time on Earth where living was really, really hard, or periods of lots of war. It doesn't account for that. It does account for, things like modern medicine and what else? Mental health and differences between the sexes, et cetera, and class and stuff like that. But then there's some other major factors that are sort of missing from this picture.
And here's an interesting enigma here. The pre-Champlain Canadian Maritimes.
Yeah.
Very old, one of the oldest life expectancies ever. And here, Samuel de Champlain wrote in his visit to Mi'kmaq and Huron communities, he met people over 100 years old. Daniel Paul attributed the incredible lifespan in the region to low stress, healthy diets of lean meats, diverse vegetables, legumes, plus, so they're eating like perfect fats, like omega-3s. This is clearly you are what you eat.
Yeah, no, I found that very interesting too. And like apparently you still see that today, right? There's these areas called the blue zones where people have a fairly low stress life and they're eating really, really well. And those communities have a tendency to live extremely long lives. And you don't see that elsewhere in the world. So it just goes to show, like you said, what you are is what you eat. And I mean, frankly, one of the reasons why we do what we do today, growing our own food, because we know that the food supply is totally contaminated.
Yeah, absolutely. And that brings us to some of the next graphs. This is interesting. So life expectancy basically started to go up, let's say in 1870, 1880, when we started practicing medicine and more sanitary conditions, and we started learning things about disease. And it skyrocketed here in the 50s with more modern medicine and better food and less starvation and things like that. Almost no one on Earth is starving anymore, which brings that life expectancy even higher.
Mm-hmm.
And so now we have these maximum life expectancies, which peaked around 2018, 2020. And since then, almost everywhere on Earth, life expectancies have begun to drop.
Yes.
Including Austria, the UK, and especially in the US.
Yes. Yeah. And there's probably a number of reasons for that.
Yeah. Well, so what were you thinking?
Well, I was thinking about that the food supply is becoming more and more toxic, but I was also thinking about the lovely vaccine that a lot of people have taken. And I wonder if that plays a role in these numbers right now.
Well, here is an interesting comparison that will blow your mind. Life expectancy versus healthcare expenditure. Now, if you just think about that critically, you would think the more healthcare expenditure per capita, the longer you would live, correct?
Yeah.
It is, in fact, the opposite. Take a look at the US here. Our per capita health expenditure is over $10,000 here, and our life expectancy is some of the lowest in the entire planet.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you think about that, obviously there are several factors within that, right? Like the healthcare system obviously is completely screwed up. It's like a collusion between the health insurance industry and the medical industry. But then also you've got a lot of pharmaceuticals that in reality aren't doing anything for you. They're probably just creating toxicity in your body and masking symptoms, but not actually curing anything. So you've got more and more people relying on pharmaceuticals. I was looking at a tweet, a post, whatever you want to call it, by somebody on X recently who was talking about how she went to the doctor recently and her doctor was like horrified that she wasn't on any medication. And it was like very unusual. It was something she doesn't usually see, which is crazy, right? Like, isn't that a good thing if you're not on medication, if you don't need it? Not to mention the toxicity of the medications themselves.
Yeah. It's interesting looking at these graphs. It seems like life expectancy was rising everywhere until about 2010 in the US when it plateaued. This is like the maximum toxicity of food, GMOs allowed into the food stream, glyphosate, and
Right.
and then life expectancy starts to drop, and then we get that jab thing going on there. It
Right.
looks like the same thing happens in the UK with a lag time of a few years, 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
Because it is the foods in Europe are cleaner still than American foods. Many of the ingredients in our foods in the US are banned in Europe.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's true too of things like just general allergens, like things that are in detergents, et cetera. There's a whole bunch of allergens that the EU does not allow that the US does.
Yeah, and this is just crazy thinking about life expectancy rapidly declining here. Look at the rapid decline here. This is Russia.
Oh, wow.
Now, I wonder
Interesting.
did they take a lot of jabs there in Russia?
I think they had didn't they largely have Novavax? Which
Yeah,
is a different
here's
vaccine?
India also shows a 4-year drop in just 2 years.
Yeah. Well,
Also
and this graph
major,
only goes up to 2021, so they're showing a drop
yeah,
off. It's a little hard for me to see, but maybe even pre-2020 that was
2019 is
starting.
the flexure point and all that is 2019 here.
Right, right,
Yep.
right.
2019 to 2020 was the first data set that dropped in all of these graphs.
Well, so there's something else interesting about that too, right? Because probably in 2019 we lost a lot of the elderly population to COVID, most likely, or other
Or
conditions
intubation.
around, or integrate, or other conditions like treatment and living alone in nursing homes and stuff like that. So once you don't have that part of the population, and then you have the remaining population starting to drop off like flies for other reasons, that's going to lower the life expectancy number pretty significantly.
Now, just like take a look at this angle of this graph here for Russia or India. And if we just project it out to Agenda 2030 down here, the bottom
Mm-hmm.
right, it
Mm-hmm.
literally goes to 45
Yeah.
for life expectancy.
Yeah. Yeah. So that slope, if that continues, there's a big problem. Of course, I think the globalists would be happy about that.
Exactly. And I think that's what's going on here and what we're showing the data for.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter how much you spend per capita on healthcare, it apparently is death care, especially when it comes to the US here.
Oh, well, then also you have to consider, I mean, obviously this is going to be relatively small in the scheme of everything globally, but I was just learning a bit more about Canada's MAID program, Assistance in
Oh, yeah.
Dying. And
They
they've
just
now
ramped that up.
they've just extended that program to drug addicts. I mean, it's like all you have to do is say, like, I'm depressed, I don't want to live anymore. And they're like, okay, I'm an addict, I'm an alcoholic, I don't want to live anymore. Okay. That 10,000 people died via the MAID program, I think in 2021. and they keep extending the program. It's like, it's hard to look at that and not see that there's an agenda to get rid of people.
Well, I've been on the TikToks. Euthanasia is cool these days.
It's so sick and gross. I mean, you have people who are, broke, who want to use the MAID program because they can't get on their feet financially. I mean, that's just sick.
Don't kill yourself, get a job, and stay tuned after the break. We're going to talk about the aquatic ape hypothesis and a 500,000-year-old wooden structure.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.
Who owns you? If you're not in control, then someone else is. Join me, Ivy West, for Voices on the Wind, Saturday. I discuss government, health, metaphysics, suppressed science, universal mysteries, little-known incredible facts, alternative energies, and even more than you can imagine.
There was blood on the wire.
Won't you join us on Revolution Radio Saturdays for Voices on the Wind with me, Ivy West.
There are lives in the balance, people under fire, children at the cannons.
Because if your head's in the sand, your tail is a target.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, the #1 listener-supported radio station on the internet. Please help support this station so this battle can continue forward. Revolution Radio!
The Secret Kindergarten is here for the young children of the world. The best program on the radio for kids, dealing with the most important topics in the whole universe. Fairy tales, music and movement, numbers, plants, animals, fun, colors, insects. Take care and cast your ears out to catch a story from the world of other young things. Reach out, up, under, and over. Sing a song. Talk about feelings. Just remember the magic word. The magic word is no. Step on into the Secret Kindergarten. Saturdays, 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. Eastern Time, right here on Revolution Radio.
Join me on the Brian Rouge Show on Revolution Radio, Eastern Standard Time, every Tuesday night from 6 to 8. We talk about the four most vital things, in my view, affecting all of humanity. Number one is UFOs and aliens and their agenda for the advancement of humanity. Number two is the Jewish establishment's control over all aspects of human civilization. Number three, the truth about Adolf Hitler, how he was the opposite of what we've been told. Number four is advanced ancient global civilizations. Join me on the Brian Rouge Show, Tuesday nights from 6 to 8 on Studio B on Revolution Radio.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. Any commercial advertising you may hear in this program is of the sole discretion and benefit of the host of whose program you are listening to. Revolution Radio does not endorse any commercial products, nor does it accept monetary compensation for on-air advertising of commercial products, nor will it ever. We are and shall remain 100% listener supported. Any product advertising on this program are considered used at buyer risk, and Revolution Radio shall not be held liable for any claims or damages received from any product advertised within this program. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps. The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, for the second half of Cosmic Catastrophe on Revolution.Radio Studio B, #1 listener-supported internet radio. Go over to Revolution.Radio, right at the top of the page, become a Patreon and support the work and support free speech. You can also rewatch the show tonight on Magnetic Reversal News, 8 p.m. Mountain Time, and see all the visuals we're going to talk about. We are going to be discussing some amazing discoveries in archaeology, and then we're also going to talk about a controversial theory of why humans don't have hair. And it's not because we're aliens. Maybe it's because we're aquatic apes.
It's very interesting.
Have you ever looked into that theory?
I have not.
Well, we're going to dive in today. Can you see the screen?
Yes, I can.
All right, let's talk about the 476,000-year-old wooden structure unearthed in Zamibia. For those that don't know, or Zambia. In September of this year, archaeologists published a paper. They found an ancient wooden structure at the archaeological site of Colombo Falls in Zambia. The structure dated to around 476,000 years old. It has no known parallels in Africa or Eurasia in the Paleolithic and may represent the earliest use of wood. The reason they think there's the use of wood is because there is this notch here and two pieces of wood that are laying just like a log cabin would be built. And then upon further inspection, they found all of the telltale signs of woodworking and scraping on these artifacts.
Yeah. I mean, this is pretty cool for a number of reasons, right? That there's a reason why you typically wouldn't find wood artifacts during this period, which is that they're going to decompose, right? But this was preserved, like, I guess, in an aquifer under a river, and the water itself helped preserve the wood. And some of it has mineralized, it's semi-fossilized, and it's in fact being kept in storage in water because that's the only way to keep it from further degradation.
That's even how they photographed it to find these tool marks in underwater.
Yeah, exactly, which is pretty interesting. But then, of course, also, according to the official narrative of how we evolved, supposedly we were just nomadic hunter-gatherers or something in this time period. So the fact that there's what clearly must be a structure just based on the way those logs are interlocking, like Lincoln logs, that puts everything into question about whether or not we were nomadic, right? I mean, I suppose we could have been seasonally nomadic, right? And there's a structure built for certain periods of time in a particular area, but...
Yeah, I was thinking that this might have something to do with the area for hunting and fishing, like a dock.
Right.
Look at these tools. These are modified wood tools they found at the site. They are highly advanced and 500,000 years old and apparently not used by a different species other than us.
Actually, I think that these artifacts, in fact, are much younger, like somewhere around like 350,000 years old. I think that's what I read. But the wood structure is 476,000 years old. So these were found above.
From similar hominids at the site.
Right. I mean, it's still an awesome find, like no question.
Now, it was only until recently that Homo sapiens we were sitting at around 200,000, 250,000 years old with the oldest fossils they knew of us, Cro-Magnon types, people just like humans, modern humans. Yeah. But finds in Morocco push that back further than maybe even 350,000 years or older.
Sure.
And so that's a huge jump. So to even think that we only go back 350,000 years is probably ridiculous because we have almost no fossils of primates or hominids at all. They're just fragments. And so when they put together a chart like this is probably only 1 to 5% of what was actually going on.
Right. But it is still really interesting to think about the fact that at 476,000 years ago, We definitely had Homo heidelbergensis around, which I think that's where we get Neanderthals and Denisovians, I think. And they start showing up around, in our record anyway, they start showing up around 500,000 years ago. So this is roughly the same time as this structure. So that's interesting in and of itself, that there were other hominids around, and probably multiple hominids at this time. So we don't even know which species is responsible for this structure, which is really interesting.
Well,
because this is not how we think. Like, this is not how we think about Neanderthals or Denisovians, right?
Well, at the same time, there could be Neanderthals, which go back probably 600,000 or further. Heidelbergensis may go back 1 million years.
Mhm.
And we have this hominid called Homo naledi, which goes back 4 million years, that shows up in 3 different places, including this time. And at this time, Homo naledi was just discovered to be burying its dead. Not only were they burying their dead, they were burying them in caves.
Yeah.
Absolutely bizarre. Deep in caves, there are assemblages found of this hominid called Homo naledi that were being buried in funerary type things, where they were making holes and putting their loved ones inside.
Yeah, I mean, I've said this a number of times, but stuff like this really, to me, goes to show how much we undersell the capabilities of ourselves long ago and our ancestors. You know, it's like the picture is like, oh, everybody is like just a savage who's barely capable of doing anything way far back, but that's clearly not the case based on what we find in the archaeological record.
Yeah. And the whole concept of us evolving from apes is kind of ridiculous, but people still hang on to that idea because if you actually look at it from a paleontological standpoint, there is 0 similarities between apes and humans except our shape.
Mm-hmm.
Apes don't have subcutaneous fat like humans have.
Right.
Apes' skin is typically not the color of humans' skin. It's typically very dark black, more like dogs or farm animal skin.
Mm-hmm.
They don't. They're also covered completely in hair.
Mm-hmm.
And apes don't have the ability to hold their breath.
Oh, that's interesting.
No primate does.
Huh.
The only animals that hold their breath are mammals in the ocean: dolphins, whales, walruses, porpoise, those things. And so you start to wonder why humans can also hold their breath and we don't have any fur, just like all of the things swimming in the ocean that used to walk on land. Now, before we get to the aquatic ape theory, let me blow your mind here. Whales, dolphins, and porpoises evolved on land. They were walking and breathing on land, and they eventually made their way to the ocean, which they are now in at the current time. But they all came from the land. And maybe, just maybe, let's say 1 million years ago or a few million years ago, when we have all these hominids walking around, the aquatic ape idea is that most of the sapiens were living on land. They were living in the forests, but maybe a group of them got separated or a new species formed that lived by the sea. And if you were a hominid living by the sea, you would be eating more omega-3 fatty acids. Your brain could get bigger. Mm-hmm. You would also require more subcutaneous fat because if you were wading in the water, you would need to protect yourself from the temperature fluctuations. Also, wading in the water allows sapiens to stand more upright because there's less pressure on their hips. So you would develop a more vertical position. And then the idea is that we evolved that way for a while, and then something pushed us away from the ocean back into the forest.
Interesting.
Yeah, pretty cool, huh?
Yeah, that's interesting.
Do you know the Nirvana cover of that photo with the baby they chucked in the pool and everyone was up in arms?
Yeah.
Human babies are born underwater often.
Yes.
Human babies are the only mammal that has the pre-forethought or not genetic knowledge to know to hold its breath.
Well, but also babies they're basically breathing liquid when they're in the womb.
Yeah. So how do they know when they're out of the womb to hold their breath when they're dumped back into liquid?
Right. Yeah, it's interesting.
Very
I'm trying to
bizarre. Also, humans can dive almost hundreds of feet deep. We have these sports where humans hold their breath for minutes and dive to hundreds of feet. If we were from the surface, how is that even possible? There are no mammals that really do that, but are there? There's whales that can do that and
Right.
porpoises.
Right. That's interesting. I just really never thought about that. Like, what is the purpose of being able to hold your breath if you're on land? It's very interesting. I mean, I've certainly asked the question many times, like, why do we have so little hair? And we're completely different than most other mammals that way, except for, things like dolphins and whales.
Other people point out diving as a sport. Like, why is that a sport? Why are we equipped to do these amazing dives, streamlined dives, and we can dive in from high depths and not hit the bottom by the shape of our bodies and the pre-knowledge that we have? Like, it's not natural that a species on Earth would have these abilities in water. It's just a bizarre, something to think about. We're streamlined. We don't have hair, so we move quicker through the water. Just like all of the mammals that were once on land that now have moved to the ocean have no hair, whales, porpoises. Is it possible that we were about to evolve into aquatic creatures, but something pushed us back onto land?
I cannot remember, but I'm having a vague recollection of the idea that we have a lot of genetic similarities to dolphins. Does that sound familiar to you?
Yes, absolutely. But we have a lot of genetic similarities to chickens too.
Well, that's true. Yeah, that's fair. I mean,
so the idea is that before the Ice Age started, we were able to live, all the hominids that were the naked ones, hairless ones, us, were living on the coast because there was no Ice Age. It was warm and temperate, and we were becoming these water creatures. And then about 2.5 million years, 2 million years ago, it got really cold, and it forced us naked, shivering, pathetic hominids into caves and forced us to make clothing out of leather to survive. And I believe this theory makes a lot of sense. And because we have these large brains and we're now forced into this new situation, we have to think and cope of ways to surviving, building structures. And that's when everything blossoms.
I mean, the other interesting thing about this is that, if you look at all of the time on Earth and the periods that we spend in cold versus very warm, the periods of time that we spend in cold are far exceed the periods of time that we've spent in warm. So it again makes me ask this question, like, why don't we have fur? Like, I keep wondering about that.
And look at this. So the Ice Age starts right here at 2 million, and look at what happens on this graph. All of the Homo species just show up right at the Ice Age. Why would we show up at the worst time on Earth?
Right.
Everything was the same and quiet before then, and a huge shift happened, and we needed to have new species or we wouldn't make it.
But as you point out, the paleontological record is woefully incomplete.
Yeah.
And it could, it's possible that something like all of those hominids showing up at 2 million years, it could be a function of preservation, right? The climactic conditions creating a situation where we have more preservation, and so therefore we find more.
Do you know why that is? Because these discoveries begin being found at this time in the caves. It gets cold, and we have to go into caves, and that's where all this gets preserved for millions of years.
Yeah.
Yep. So thank God it got cold, or we wouldn't know any of this. All the hominids would be living out in the land, and their bodies would rot, and the bone would completely deteriorate, and we would have no record at all. So the reason this record all of a sudden shows up is because we had to go into caves. Now, the way they talk about this is pretty crazy too. It's like electric universe, it's like this crazy pseudoscientific theory. So let me read you this. The aquatic ape theory, now largely dismissed, tries to explain the origins of many of humankind's unique traits. It was popularized in the 70s and 80s by Elaine Morgan. I implore you to go look at some of her video productions. The theory suggests that early hominids lived in water at least part of the time. And this aquatic lifestyle supposedly accounts for our hairless bodies, which made us more streamlined for swimming and diving, our upright two-legged walking, which made wading easier, and our layers of subcutaneous fat, which made us better insulated in the water. The theory even links an aquatic existence to the evolution of speech and the dropping of our larynx.
Why would that be connected?
There's a whole paper on that.
Okay.
Certain animals like dolphins can speak and their larynx is dropped the same as humans, where there's like no other mammal with a dropped larynx.
Because there's another sort of theory about speech, etc. So part of the idea of this is that in order to have enough space in the throat to have that dropped larynx and being capable of speech, our heads have to be of a certain size, and that this is part of the reason why humans are born as small and vulnerable as we are compared to other mammals, right? Everybody else is able to like walk on the first day, et cetera, and we're completely incapable of doing anything for like 3 years. So that's interesting.
And also interesting is that a baby is has 5 times more fat than any primate at birth. So if you were to take a baby primate and throw it in the water, it would immediately drown. If you threw any human baby in water, it would bob like a bobber. And babies also know how to right themselves. You could spin a baby in the water. He will always turn head up and breathe when he's out of the water and hold his breath underwater. No one can explain this. And it would only be explained through genetic knowledge and us being aquatic.
Are you saying that babies automatically hold their breath underwater?
Yes, and when you spin them in water, they automatically turn face up.
I wonder who ran that experiment and if they were accused of crimes against humanity.
Probably.
Let's stick this baby's head underwater and see what happens.
The theory developed before major discoveries of ancient hominin fossils in East Africa occurred. Now, the hypothesis was initially proposed by an English marine biologist, Alistair Hardy, which makes sense because he's studying all these things like porpoises and whales and dolphins, and he makes the connection with humans through the hairlessness, the fat, and the fact that we're this enigma. No one has an explanation for why we're naked.
Yeah.
And so Alistair Hardy came up with this in 1960, who argued that a branch of apes, he said back then, but he meant hominids, was forced by competition over terrestrial habitats to hunt for food such as shellfish on the coast and in the seabed. And we know that at this time, maybe 2 million years ago, before we pop into existence, that there were tons of hominids competing on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
Because the Ice Age happens and all of a sudden we find them all in the caves. There were lots of different hominids competing. So this actually is a great argument.
I'm trying to remember too that I have a recollection a long time ago of reading about somebody or maybe a group of people who believed that adult humans can learn to breathe water. I'm trying to remember if this came out of a fiction book or some nonfiction I was reading, but I bet that there's experiments of people trying to learn how to breathe water, considering that we breathe liquid in utero.
Yeah, that's pretty creepy.
Yeah, it is a little creepy, but interesting. So, okay, so here's the other thing that I'm wondering about here, right? Supposedly our most related ancestor is a chimpanzee, not an ape. So how does that fit into this equation? Is it an aquatic chimpanzee or an aquatic ape?
No, I mean, when they say most related, we're not related to chimpanzees in any way. It's a separate species. It's a separate order. These are people that are putting together things that don't go together. There is no missing link in any of the fossil record. Therefore, there is no transitory species.
Well,
species
in that case,
spontaneously show up and
ape.
very little explanation during mass extinctions. So there's major death and carnage and major renewal across boundaries through geologic time.
Right,
and what our studies have shown is it's usually driven by cosmic catastrophes, cosmic rays, or some other type of major catastrophe, which changes the climate completely.
Well, I mean, and in that case, then the aquatic ape is really an aquatic hominid, don't you think? Like, there's
Yeah,
no
it's an
reason to
aquatic
say it's an
hominid,
ape.
not an ape.
Yeah.
We're not related to apes. Apes are separate and they still exist and they're separate from us, not related. Hominids are separate, a separate lineage. And it says, yeah, so they're going to go on with aquatic ape theory. They just call it that. It's so annoying because much more than any, but it's the fact that we can, these hominids are so different, the ones that we know of now, which are just us, than apes. Because of the way we sweat and the fact that we have salt that comes out of our tear ducts. Apes don't do these things. And so they're claiming that that is more evidence that we live by the sea. It was tear ducts and sweating is for us to rid salt from our body because we'd be constantly ingesting it.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So much more than other primates, man has several features that are seen more often in aquatic rather than terrestrial mammals. The first is nakedness. Then there's this thick subcutaneous fat layer. There's nothing on land that has that, really. There's only a few animals, but they also may be related. They may have evolved aquatically and gone onto land.
Well, that's what I was just thinking about, right? Because consider animals like pigs and hippopotamus who do sweat and don't have any fur, typically. Or they have some, but not very much.
We'd have to look into that.
And we're closely related to
They
pigs,
may
right?
have been aquatic and then evolved onto land, whereas the reverse happened with the whales and the porpoise.
Well, consider too, like an animal like the hippopotamus, right? Basically does spend a lot of its time in water as it is.
Yeah, this is just such an interesting hypothesis. It really gives you pause.
Yeah, no, most definitely. No question.
And they're bringing it back to that time, 2.5 million to 1.4 million years ago, the genus Homo emerged. Africa became drier, and during certain seasons, already dry savannas became even more arid. So everyone was doing well on land, all these Homo species, and then during the Ice Age, climate shifted worldwide and drove a Homo species to the shore because you're guaranteed food if you live on the edge of the ocean. It's right there in the ocean. And you change your diet from nuts, fruits, and vegetables, which you've been eating for millions of years, to all of a sudden these heavy, fatty omega-3 fishes and proteins. And your brain gets huge. And then you accidentally eat a mushroom and
Well, and also
like baby.
Right. You know, and even during an ice age, living on a coast is going to be warmer than anywhere else. So that needs to be taken into consideration as well.
Yeah, so I can see this actually working. It says the fossil record hints to the importance of aquatic environments. Wrangham and his team took nearly 20 hominid fossil sites in East and South Africa. In East Africa, the geologic and fossil evidence suggests that hominids were living in areas with lakes, flooded grasslands, or other wetland areas. South African sites tended to be drier, but were still located near streams or water. So foraging in these wetland environments may have led to habitual upright walking, because when you're like wading in a pond, you're standing up.
Yeah.
So this could have been the shift 2 million years ago to upright people. And one of them went hairless and stayed by the shore until it got too cold, and then he went in a cave. And it was us. And we were naked, and we painted Lascaux Cave, and it was beautiful. And then we built Göbekli Tepe, and now we're about to go to World War III.
But you missed the part where we're also, building wooden structures, 500,000 years ago. It's like by water.
Once we become smart, we're as smart back then as we are today.
Right. I mean, this idea that we were stupid, it doesn't make any sense. Like, what's that? Why would that be the assumption? It's again the assumption of that all progress happens in this linear fashion, that the further we go back in time, the stupider, the less civilized we are, the less inventive we are, blah, 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 the less we can do. It's just not true. I mean, we keep finding things in the archaeological record that suggest that we were just as smart then as we are now. So maybe we're not really that smart.
And I think it's cyclic. Well, next week, let's talk about the Yuga cycle and the ascension and descension. And because if you want to see stupid, just check out Congress.
Right. And the fact that we're about to start World War III and we're about to block out the sun when it's about to get really cold.
Yeah.
And we're going to cut down forests for carbon.
Baby.
Yeah.
Well, it's been a great show. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see y'all next week. Watch the replay tonight on Magnetic Reversal News on YouTube, 8 p.m. Mountain Time. Be safe. We love you. Bye.
Bye.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. We'll be right back after this message.